Good morning. Good morning. Gosh, there's quite a lot of energy in the room today, which is fantastic when you're about to revisit a policy agenda that was launched almost 25 years ago, and I think bodes well for what should be a really, really interesting and exciting event today. I'm Matt Leach from Local Trust, and this event is looking back at the lessons, the history, the legacy of the National Strategy for Neighbourhood Renewal, and everything that came out of that. And we'll have a session today which involves an initial Q&A within the panel, some experts joining us, and then we'll open up to the floor for you all to contribute. And looking out at the audience today, I can see that there are a lot of people with a lot of history in the policy area that we're engaging with. Also, really excitingly, civil servants dealing and think tank staff dealing with some of the challenges now which feel almost as relevant, if not more relevant, than they did back in 1997-98. And I think I'd like to start by thinking back 26 years ago to 1997. And the day after he was elected, Tony Blair visited the Aylesbury estate in London and declared that communities would be at the heart of the government's policy agenda, highlighting the extent to which many of the key societal challenges which the then new Labour government had committed to addressing, crime, health, education, opportunity, were often complex, intertwined, and focused in particular in specific neighbourhoods across the country. And to address that, he set in train a cross-Whitehall policy development process that in some ways prefigured similar efforts in recent years in preparing the Levelling Up White Paper. And 25 years ago, this autumn, the Social Exclusion Unit published Bringing Britain Together, a National Strategy for Neighbourhood Renewal, which set out a comprehensive cross-government plan for addressing those challenges. And that in turn set the scene for a programme, the New Deal for Communities, a neighbourhood-focused programme, which perhaps uniquely for a government intervention initiative of that size and ambition was subsequently evaluated as both having met most of its objectives, but also in doing so achieved good value for money. But surprisingly, I guess despite that, and since then, a neighbourhood focus for policy has been almost entirely absent from the public debate. We haven't heard much of it. We didn't hear much of it from the coalition government. We haven't heard much of it subsequently in Liverpool last week at the Labour Party conference. There was an awful lot of conversation about community, a lot of conversations about devolution, but very few people talking about the particular challenges of neighbourhoods and the focus of social exclusion in those places that continues today. Perhaps different places from those that drove the National Strategy for Neighbourhood Renewal, but in many ways similar in terms of the challenges faced. So in looking back on the lessons of the New Deal for Communities and the National Strategy for Neighbourhood Renewal, I'm delighted that we'll be joined slightly later this morning by Angie Wright, who's the Chief Officer of Be Inspired. That's a community business, a successor body to the Leicester New Deals for Communities programme in Braunston, and she'll talk a little bit about both the experience of the programme itself, but also the legacy that's endured in her community. We'll also be joined, I'm delighted, by Sarah Pearson. Sarah's Professor of Social Research at the Centre for Regional Economic and Social Research and Director of the Social and Economic Research Institute at Sheffield Hallam University. More importantly, she spent more than 20 years researching interventions at a level of neighbourhood and local community and was Deputy Director of the National Evaluation of the New Deals for Communities programme between 2001 and 2010. So they'll be joining us for a panel session in about half an hour's time. But first of all, I'm delighted and privileged that we've been joined by the Right Honourable Baroness Armstrong of Hilltop. Hilary Armstrong was Minister for Local Government, Housing and Regeneration between 1997 and 2001. She was lead Minister for Work on Local Government, Regeneration and Homelessness undertaken by the then newly established Social Exclusion Unit, driving forward work on what became the New Deal for communities. She was subsequently in Cabinet as Chief Whip, then Minister at the Cabinet Office with particular responsibility for social exclusion. She retired from the Commons and went to the Lords in 2010, and since then has been a continuous advocate for the causes that she championed as a minister, and I've been really pleased that she's been part of the great work taken forward by Paul Howell and Diana Johnson as part of the all-party parliamentary group on Left Behind Neighbourhoods. Hilary, I'm incredibly grateful that you've joined us to share your perspectives and experience on what was, in retrospect, I think one of the most important initiatives launched by the new Labour government you were a part of. And I guess my first question to you is, what prompted New Labour to launch that process that led us to the national strategy and the NDC? Well,
there was an understanding that since the post-war government, there had been a gradual, my husband always put it as incremental tackling of inequality in the deciles. So if you looked at, the 10 years around the Attlee government and following, there was a reduction in the number of people who were not benefiting. And there was that gradual movement, but that we had reached a level where there was a grouping that was really quite intractable. And the truth is that the Labour government, other than through NDC, was only beginning to get down into those groups. What we did was lift the next group up out of poverty, largely through things like Sure Start, like new job opportunities that were linked to benefit, so you could work, you could continue to get some benefit, but also work if you're a single parent, if you had a disability. And that was lifting the people who were engaged. But then there was another raft of people who were not getting connected, and there were communities where the trajectory of people born in those communities was really quite frightening. And we did talk about that. I mean, you have to understand, the Prime Minister was my neighbour in the constituencies. So, and I knew his constituency very, very well, because my dad had represented a bit of it when he'd been an MP. And, I talked to him about this sort of thing a lot. And I didn't know he was going to be Aylesbury. I was delighted by it. But we knew we couldn't simply have business as usual. And one of my tasks going into the Department of Environment, Transport and the Regions, as we called it, the mega department that John Prescott looked after, it was my job to actually work out what we're going to do there. And Dick Hayborn was also involved. And we had a real go at this. But I kept hold of the Social Exclusion Unit, and I got the Cabinet Committee together.
But that was it was an interesting launch, wasn't it? Because looking back on the 1997 manifesto, there was almost nothing in it about community, was there? I found community was mentioned once and perhaps neighbourhood twice in relation, I think, to culture and the arts. Where did this come from? Was there a secret plan?
No, it wasn't a secret plan. It was simply a knowledge, this is an issue you can't duck. And to be perfectly honest as well, it's not a great election issue. You don't want to go into communities and say, you're having such a terrible time. We're going to do this, that and the other. People don't want to be labelled as poor, as deprived. It was our job to recognise who they were, where the localities were, which is why we introduced the index of multiple deprivation, which nobody uses anymore. But we introduced that, and that was critical because it gave us down to below ward level what was happening in every neighbourhood. And once you had that, you knew you had a responsibility to do something. I mean, you know, we didn't do that. We've been in a couple of years, but, you know, we got it.
And this was very much, you know, your personal mission as minister. It was within your brief, but it was something where there was a clear central lead from number 10, wasn't there?
Yeah.
And how did that work? How did you manage that as a dynamic?
I can be very irreverent given I'm in here. It was the Methodist connection. Robert Hill was the special advisor. He'd worked with Tony before the election. I knew Robert well. Robert was also a very good Methodist. I come from a very strong Methodist tradition. And Robert and I, we hardly needed to talk. We knew what each other thought about things. And the key thing was I gained the confidence of John Prescott, who'd not been, you know, he'd not sort of been seen himself as one of my political allies. But he said to me after about 6 weeks, I've worked out you're not just a spy from him. You actually, you know, you keep me informed. I always told John everything I was doing. He knew I had a political handle on things. He knew me from the NEC anyway, and he trusted me, so he just gave me the opportunity to get on with things.
So do you think are there some lessons there for levelling up? Because in some ways there was, you know, similarities in terms of process, you know, big government ambition, cross-departmental involvement, and yet two years on, the levelling up process seems to have stalled, whereas what you launched continued for, what, 8 years?
I remember the civil servant at the Cabinet Office who had responsibility for the Cabinet Committee saying to me one day, we didn't know what on earth you meant by things like antisocial behaviour. But he said, every one of you ministers come in and tell us stories about it, almost every week, about what's happening on estates. He said, the truth is, it's way beyond our day-by-day knowledge and experience. So it's been a real learning point for us. So we actually set up for the civil servants a weekly seminar where we brought people in from outside who talked about these issues and so on to back up what they were hearing in the cabinet committees. And it was, and the truth is, I was talking to Paul Boateng about it yesterday, because Paul was in the Treasury and was critical to getting some of the agreements in the Treasury about how we managed the money across departments, and he was very important in getting Gordon to put into a budget public service agreements which brought together the ambitions of different departments in tackling disadvantage and so on. And you couldn't deliver the PSA, which got you the money from Treasury, unless you worked across the piece. So it was very deliberate, organisational stuff to make sure it worked across the board. And again, you know, it is the Methodist connection, because Paul's another Methodist. And basically, that commitment to wherever we were sitting, we had to be part of it. The most interesting challenge came from the DWP when they said, we know how to go for the next layer down, the low-hanging fruit. But if you ask us to go any further than that, that's really difficult for us. It's very expensive, but, you know, it's also how do we make those connections? And that, for me, was a really interesting thing, because that was the minister in DWP being very honest with us about what their challenges were, about talking about really working for the most disadvantaged. And it was how we collectively worked all this together. I mean, you know, I had the army and the armed forces involved too, and we send people up to Catterick so that before people were kicked out, they actually got some training and support about what networks would be available for them when they came out. So we really did a cross-government thing.
But but when you came in, you'd inherited actually quite an ambitious cross-government programme in its own right. By coincidence, this is the 30th anniversary of John Gummer standing up and announcing the single regeneration budget, and clearly some significant bits of Whitehall, 4 or 5 departments, had been mobilised behind this big programme. How easy did you find it to shift officials from the focus that they had on a kind of government regional office-led local area regeneration programmes to the much broader-based ambitions of the National Strategy for Neighbourhood Renewal?
The very weird thing you find when you become a minister is that the civil service used to say, we're not allowed to tell you what we did for the previous administration. We can't go through with you what happened there. So I never asked questions, just go on with it. And, you know, they were great with us. We had a very good senior civil servant, Moira Wallace, running the SEU. And she knew Whitehall, which was very important. I didn't at that stage. Later, I made sure I always had SPADs who knew Whitehall. But I had a SPAD who was a local government person, and he was fabulous. And he eventually ended up number 10, of course. John Prescott gave me a SPAD, which was very unusual for a Minister of State. But he knew that I was doing some heavy lifting in local government because we had big local government legislation too. So, you know, I never had any problems with motivating and getting very good response from the civil service. We did have regional officers that were very important. And again, I went to a regional office. I remember I went to the Yorkshire office and somebody I knew was in there, and they said they were all terrified because you know more of the local government leaders than they do. And I did. I knew every single Labour government leader. I'd spent 2 years getting to know them. And I went to all the LGA meetings. So I knew what was out there. And I knew all the key players that you had to persuade to actually do things. They didn't like everything I was doing, I can tell you, but you know, we had a good exchange on things.
So you mobilised ministers across Whitehall, you mobilised the Methodist Church, you got civil servants working, and you reached out to local government, and you created a programme which ran on for most of the lifespan of the new Labour government. What elements of it were you proudest of, looking back? Which do you think had the most impact, both in the short term and the long term?
I mean, I was very proud of what we did on street homelessness, which was another SEU report that came out slightly later, but gave us the model to tackle street homelessness, and that's how we recruited Louise Casey, and thereby hangs a tale. So I was really pleased about that. But I love the NDC because I trained as a social worker and switched to community work, and I'd been training youth and community workers in the North East and being a community activist in my hometown of Sunderland for, before that was what I did before I came into Parliament. And I knew that the world massively underestimates people in poor communities and their capacity. I knew that. I'd worked with them. I lived among them in a place called Southwick in Sunderland, where there used to be shipyards, and Mrs. Thatcher had just closed the last of the shipyards when I became the community worker. So I knew about this, and you knew that actually you can open up different ways of doing this if you trust and enable local people to take root and take hold of the policy so that you do something rather than just talk about it. I think that one of the things was the longer term, that, you know, these were, NDC was 10-year programme, and the money was clear to people for 10 years. And what I think you'll hear from the Leicester experience later was that what they did in order to make the best of the money in Braunston was very important, and we were encouraging them to find ways of establishing more independent money, in a sense, because one of the things that I didn't ever succeed in was managing to make the evaluation and accountability straightforward. And you would go to groups and they would, you know, some poor treasurer was spending all day doing the different, filling in the different forms for the different people they were getting money from, which was ludicrous, because it wasn't really sorting things out. And I never managed to sort that, and that's one of my big regrets, because I think that would have made life a lot easier for people at the grassroots, although I was always very strong with my students that they had to get the money right, because that was the thing that saw most community workers fall over. Somebody nicked the dinner money or whatever. So you got to be careful about that. But we made it so bureaucratic; it was terrible.
Certainly, our experience running the big local programme on a smaller scale, but across 10 years in, you know, neighbourhoods which weren't dissimilar from NDC neighbourhoods, showed that actually local people trusting with money are often a lot more careful than the public sector when it comes to ensuring that it doesn't go astray.
Absolutely.
Interesting, when you look at the evaluations, and you mentioned putting local people in the lead, the evaluation work done by Pete Tyler, who I think is somewhere in the room, will probably ask a question, seems to suggest that the NDC had the biggest impact where local people were properly in the lead. But right across the board, evaluations of the NDC showed that it worked. It hit most of its targets, it achieved value for money, and yet when it ended, there was almost complete silence. It seems to have had a bit of an image problem. How do you think that happened?
Oh, we lost an election. That's what happened. And the reality is, as I say, the next incoming government, I did the social exclusion work towards the end of the Blair administration. And it was very clear that what we were trying to do then was go back to the very people we hadn't shifted and introduce straightforward programmes to help and change that, and did some we introduced some well-evaluated programmes from around the world, particularly on early intervention for children, which were phenomenally successful but expensive, and the coalition loved them but gradually withdrew money from them, and there's only about 2 programmes left in the country now. And you know what really got up my nose was that Grant Shapps became homelessness minister. I was by then chairing a homeless organisation, and he summons this homeless organisation, the chief executive, to come and see him because their outcomes were terrific in the North East, in Newcastle in particular. And that was because we used people with lived experience as the outreach workers. And Grant Shapps forbade me from going to the meeting. My chief executive nearly pulled out. I said, no, you've got to do it. But he wouldn't have me in the building. And it was this, you can't learn from other people. And I just thought that was so sad. And then dear old, at the Cabinet Office, there was another minister who had taken up all of this, and he did all the big lottery stuff, which was great. You know, I did some work with what were meant to be the follow-ups to some of our programmes that they gave big lottery to do. but he claimed he'd never heard of people with complex needs, you know. And it was like, what has been going on? We can all learn from what other people do. And that's one of, for me, the frustrating things about the political world. People pretend nothing's ever happened before. And they're coming in and it's all new and all us. And it's rubbish.
But that's a retreat from a focus on neighbourhoods and communities has actually been common to both parties, hasn't it? Labour has been quite limited in its conversations about concentrations of need in particular areas, about putting power in the hands of local people, certainly to date. Do you think that's been a mistake?
I think that will come back. What we talked about was place-based work. And that was what the Labour Party got into. And that is very important. And there is the opportunity, and was the opportunity, for people to really concentrate on a place and see what was needed in order to turn that round. But it's sort of missed out on this stuff. So, you know, we've all got a job to do, to talk to people and let them see that this can contribute to very good places. But, you know, we're a hell of a lot further back. I mean, poverty in the northeast, child poverty, I'm doing stuff on that at the moment. Child poverty in the northeast, we're now the highest in the country, having been middle of the road in 2010, and we've now got around 40% of families with children in poverty. It's terrifying. So, you know, any new government is going to have so much to do to actually get back to where you can begin to tackle the excesses of inequality. And my anxiety is that people will go for those low-hanging fruit in ways I totally understand, because those people have got rights as well. But for the ones who are living in the most disadvantaged areas, life is really bad and really tough at the minute.
So we've talked about what was achieved. We talked about the challenges now. Do you have hope for the future?
Oh, I always have hope, because it's about people. And as I say, my experience of working with people, I now do quite a lot with women with complex needs, and I did an inquiry on women who experience violence and abuse. And, you know, we worked with about 15 people who lived experience who became peer researchers. They were trained and so on by one of the voluntary groups I was working with. And they then did work in their own neighbourhoods, interviewing other women in similar circumstances. And I used to meet them once a month. And they would kick me all around the room about what the Commission was thinking and what we needed to be doing and what their reality was and where they were. And they essentially wrote the report. They wrote their own report, and we just used it. And they gave me so much. You know, these women who'd been through the most extreme trauma, but my goodness, they have things that to offer that the world will miss if it doesn't allow them to offer it. So, you know, that's what gives me hope.
Hilary, thank you so much for an incredibly rich, interesting and hopeful half an hour of reflection on the NDC. We're just now going to take a 2-minute break whilst we invite Sarah and Angie to join us. We'll have a couple of questions across the panel, and then I'll open up for all of you to ask all the questions that you might have. And I'm sure there are already many brewing in your heads. Hilary, you've got to leave us at about 12:05, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm really sorry. Janet Anderson, who was the MP in Blackburn and Darwen, it's her memorial next door in this building at 12-ish. So I've got to go to that. So I'm really sorry I can't get round and talk to you and hear all of your experiences.
but we've got
another time.
but we've got a good 40 minutes of Q&A. Sarah, Angie, do you want to join us?
Matt, can we show our appreciation?
Oh yes. Angie, what did the NDC mean for Broadston?
Okay, good morning everybody. Can you hear? Okay. Just going to do a quick straw poll, Matt, if you don't mind. Sarah and I were just saying, how many NDC folk are around?
Mary's a chair.
Great. Well, I hope I can sort of do you justice as well when I talk about our experience. What it's meant for Broadston, I think in many ways it's been quite transformative. I grew up in the area, and if I think back to even the mid-70s, things felt better then. By the time we got to the mid-80s, things were getting a bit trickier, most definitely. And by the time we got to the 90s, there were whole streets boarded up, houses burnt out, crime completely off the scale. And unemployment was, not just the norm, but actually the expectation of most people and most families, sadly. So if you look at the area now, despite the fact that, of course, local people are experiencing all the issues that Hillary's, really passionately spoken about, and disproportionately more so. In terms of cost of living, you can walk around the area, move around the area and literally see the difference. You can see it, you can feel it in the fabric of the place, how it's improved in the housing, which has got one of the longest waiting lists in the city of Leicester. Really? In actual fact, because the housing is so good now by comparison to many of the estates and certainly to the rental market in Leicester. Lots of very poor overcrowded rental options that people have. Leicester in itself is a poor city in terms of its positioning, and the IMD, which we do use faithfully, I promise you. And you can see the difference. It was good housing to start with. It was built into war. It was good quality. There was lots of green spaces, a green lung, a park in the middle. I mean, there was so much for people to be there. It was an honour to be given a property in those days between the 30s and the 50s. And I think now all of that has become, it's more apparent that actually with investment you can turn things around. I'm not suggesting that we haven't now had the increase of ASB and crime. I think this is, an issue in many, many areas. But I suppose what we have really is all of the legacy that allows us to work still in a very joined up way with local services. We still meet every 6 weeks. We operate our own neighbourhood management system, which is the only one left in the city, whereby we still have a neighbourhood management structure. We meet with the police, health, housing officers, the local children's centres, all that sort of thing. And we do actually do joint work. And I think the big legacy, of course, is that, isn't it? It's the ability to actually, for local people and local stakeholders, to actually work together still. As the NDC body that was formed, so we've been around for 23 years now, and the point about the money, which Larry made very well, and I can say that of the £49.5 million that we were invested in by the government directly, that during the programme Life Alone, that was £72 million. We added to that in lots of different ways, through lots of different sources. That was, it was enabled by that process. And subsequent to that, we've actually been an independent organisation longer than we were actually an NDC area, of course. So the legacy is clearly strong. And we continue to invest, we continue to take on assets, to create better spaces for people, to provide more services, and continue that investment into the area. So, yeah, I think it's been transformative. But I think we're in difficult circumstances again. So we really are looking to what's happening next. Of course, we're looking to the Labour Party in particularly. We've got, good, strong MP, thankfully, Liz Kendall, who's who's always been a great supporter of the area and our work. That's where we are.
Thanks so much, Angie. Sarah, a decade on from the end of the NDC, is it time for, well, more than a decade now, a decade and a half, is it time to reevaluate it?
Yes and no. I think there's definitely a case to revisit some of those neighbourhoods, as Angie has very kind of articulately told us what continues to happen in Leicester and some of the continuing benefits in Braunston. I don't think we know enough about the legacy benefits of New Deal for Communities and what has been maintained and sustained in those neighbourhoods. I think we've got some really strong evidence on some of the outcomes associated with NDC. So we looked across 36 indicators of change. We know that for 32 of those 36 indicators, the movement was in a positive direction, so things got better across all of those indicators. We know Baroness Armstrong talked about the ambition of New Deal for Communities to close the gap between those most deprived areas and the rest of the country. We know that that happened as well. And we also know that, crucially, for a lot of those indicators, there was more change relative to similarly deprived areas. So we looked at areas that had investment from government compared to similarly deprived areas that hadn't had similar levels of investment, and things got better in those New Deal for Communities areas. But we also know that some things change more than others. So we know that there were particular benefits associated with what we called place-based outcomes. So those were things around housing, around improvements to the environment, to crime and community safety, so reductions in levels of antisocial behaviour, and so on. And they had direct benefits in terms of the way that people feel about the places in which they live. So improvements to indicators around belonging, pride in place, trust, and interestingly as well, mental health outcomes, which we hadn't actually directly anticipated, but came out really clearly as associated with those kind of improvements to people's feelings about the place in which they lived. So we know a lot about this already, but I think it's also safe to say that the world has moved on, perhaps significantly, since we did the NDC evaluation. And, there are some lessons for us, I think, in terms of not publishing 7 volumes of a final evaluation report during the period of, or just preceding a general election. And I think that's part of the reason why perhaps those findings haven't been as widely utilised as we would have perhaps liked them to have been. But I think one of the things that we are also interested in is the idea of whether there are other things that we might want to kind of capture and measure as the benefits from a New Deal for Communities type initiative. Again, and those are things around sense of well-being, collective well-being. We did some thinking in the evaluation about how we might monetize some of those well-being benefits. So Pete Tyler and colleagues did some really kind of groundbreaking work around that. But I think, that's now integrated into Treasury frameworks, and we have a much stronger sense of what collective well-being means. We didn't necessarily look at some of those outcomes. I think there are important questions around connectivity and integration in the sense of transport, physical connectivity, but also in the sense of connection to employment opportunities and job opportunities that we didn't necessarily pay enough attention to. And I think there are also really critical questions around social infrastructure and the kind of social capital within the communities. And that came through as critically important in the NDC evaluation. But again, I think we are now, perhaps we have a much stronger sense of how important those things are in terms of the continuing benefits of programmes like New Deal for Communities. So I think we could again go back to revisit some of those questions as well.
Now, I'm sure there's lots and lots of questions out there in the group that's come together today. Rather than continue a conversation between ourselves, I think probably we ought to jump quickly into inviting questions from the audience. Do we have microphones? We do at the back. Do we have some questions? Okay, first we've got on the middle row, just there. We'll take 3, then the gentleman just in front of her, and then we'll take the gentleman just in the middle in the plaid shirt.
Thanks, and good morning. It's been a brilliant discussion. I'm Katie Schmucker from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and in Baroness Armstrong we hear so clearly what you say about the people who are experiencing the deepest forms of poverty with the most intractable challenges, and a lot of our research shows that we are very much back there again with deepening poverty. We've got some research out next week looking at levels of destitution in the UK, and I can't give away the top line, but fair to say it's not a good picture. And I mean, I just wanted to ask a question though that sort of picks up where Sarah left off, which is if you were to be giving advice to an incoming government about what they should be doing around place-based community sort of renewal type activities. You know, Sarah, you were touching on, maybe we need to think differently and more about community infrastructure. You know, what are the things that you think you would advise a government to do slightly differently in the context that they would be coming into government in?
Right. I'm not sure I mean this. No, but please speak into it, then we can catch it on the video.
Kevin Sugru, retired ex-local trust. The national strategy was brilliant, I think, and really very refreshing. But looking back, for the benefit of looking forward, what would you want to do better?
Hi, Tanvi Asyan from Search Finance. We did some work with the Youth Endowment Funds where we went to Cheetham Hill in Manchester, one of the most deprived wards in the country, but also the most diverse ward in the country. And we co-designed a strategy around youth violence with the community there. And I just have kind of two questions that have came up from that kind of work. One of the things that we saw was the institutional distrust in public services and in the local authority. And as a third party, we could go in and build relationships between the community and the local authority. But what we weren't able to do was support the local authority to react to actually what the community needed. And I'll give an example. There was a particular bit of property, and the community wanted that to be a youth club. There was no real reason for it not to be a youth club. It was owned by the local authority. But we didn't have any levers of power within the local authority in order to move that on. So I guess the first question is how do we support local authorities to be more reactive to the needs of communities? And then the second thing, when we spoke to a lot of young people, many of them affected by youth violence, many of them had directly been affected by youth violence. One of the things that we continually heard was the role of entrepreneurship. And the role that entrepreneurship has in supporting many of these young people, for whom many of them, at a certain level of education, do not have prospects within the educational system. And so, and also speaking to communities both within Cheetham Hill, but also as coming from an immigrant community, the idea of entrepreneurship and this idea that we don't want to be labelled poor, we don't want to be labelled deprived, we just want the access to capital to be able to build our own businesses and build the wealth of our communities. How does an incoming government encourage private capital to invest in those brick and mortar businesses within communities, particularly in businesses that create third spaces for communities, create local talent for communities, and create local employment for communities?
There's some wide-ranging questions. Where will we start? Should we start with Hilary? Perhaps you might want to reflect on what you would want to do better if you're part of the government coming in post-election and doing it all over again. How would you change your approach?
I think the real problem is the state of the economy. And therefore, if you link what you're talking about with what you're saying in terms of how do we encourage people to become entrepreneurs more and actually support that within communities, we will end up being a lot stronger. And we didn't concentrate on that at all. I was talking to my nephew who's just got involved in an organisation in Peckham where they have taken over a building and are offering local people space and support to think about ideas that they might develop and move and so on. I opened a building recently near Borough, that bit of Southwark, down by the one of the old wharves, where a social enterprise which does advice on health and local government has gone into a really beautiful building and is now working with the community and community organisations around how they can use that to do exactly what you're talking about in that area. So I think that there are signs of people being really creative and innovative in those multi-ethnic communities that you're talking about, which I think are just stunning. And our job as a government, all the rest of it, is actually how do you effectively support that without making it so bureaucratic and all the rest of it, but just let it prosper.
So how would you advise an incoming government to achieve that?
I think they have to look at it. I mean, I get very upset that most public programmes are never evaluated, let alone going back to evaluate. But the National Audit Office put out a report at the beginning of this year moaning the fact that so little of the actual work that government pays for is ever evaluated. I would rather have a proper evaluation such as the university did than a tick box exercise, which is what governments get into. And we have to find different ways of evaluating what is working, but also of spreading good practice. We are terrible in this country at learning from the next door. We're awful at it. I tried to introduce programmes to do that in local government. And, they would listen to anybody but their next door neighbour. And I find that really frustrating. We really don't like to learn from other people. So, if I had a magic wand, that's one of the things I would say.
Angie, viewing Whitehall from Leicester, from Braunston, what did you feel they got right, and what wasn't quite as effective as you might have hoped?
I think you made reference to it in terms of the accountability and governance type thing. And as much as I think there was an intention that things would be freer, and because it was a long, it was a big investment, it was a long-term programme, that actually the shackles would be off a little bit, and there was going to be that independence and people could manage the money, effectively locally. In reality, there was actually a lot of checks and balances and monitoring. And the evaluation, as Sarah and I have joked about before, you had lorry loads of outcomes that were literally lorry loads of outcomes that you were having to report on all the time. So, with good intention, actually, I think there was still a little bit of nervousness and fear from mainly from civil servants, I don't doubt, in actually how we're going to keep the sort of reins in a little bit. This is a lot of money here, the biggest investment, ever in this type of initiative. So, there are clearly big lessons to be learnt from that, and there are ways of doing things. I think the thing about outcomes is very important, and we all do need to evidence things, of course, if not for ourselves, in any case, but for others, and especially those people spending the money. But it's the way that's done. It's the intention of that. Is it to inform? Is it to learn? Is it to be flexible? Is it to, to facilitate change? You don't want to feel as though it's just a stick, really. So there is that. The other thing is about really positioning, particularly local authority, but also local health authorities more so now, to better understand, to be better aware and better resourced to work with those particular neighbourhoods. It's still very, very difficult to work on a neighbourhood level with the governance structures that we're all in terms of public services. We try, we're parts of partnerships, you're parts of alliances, call them what you want. You're still only fluffing around the edges, quite frankly. You know, that's got to be better. That's got to be more core to the programme, because the transformation takes a very long time, and it has to keep people with it. You know, people that do make local decisions, people that do influence things, and people that, you know, spend their money. So, yeah, for me, that would be key.
And Sarah, what would your advice be for an incoming government beyond don't publish 7 volumes of evaluation? I do recommend volumes 6 and 7, which are particularly good. But for those of you who don't want to dig that far back, I'd recommend this bit of work which Sarah's been working on with colleagues at Sheffield over recent months, which attempts to draw together a lot of the learning from neighbourhood evaluations. This is a summary document. There'll be a more substantive one published in about a month's time, I believe. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, what would you, and looking at the lessons of your 7 volumes of evaluation and more, what would your top 3 or 4 lessons be for an incoming government?
So there is a really important point, I think, made by Angie and Baroness Armstrong about reducing bureaucracy and simplifying scrutiny and accountability in relation to this. And that extends to evaluation as well. I think evaluating fewer things more effectively would be a recommendation that I would make, not looking across that great raft of indicators that we looked at for NDC. There's also, I think, something about understanding the totality of investments within neighbourhoods and how different programmes work together in neighbourhoods. And I would like to see some work that helps us to understand not just discrete benefits of individual programmes, but how those programmes work together in communities like the one in which Angie's working to help those communities achieve longer-term benefits. So those are kind of questions around accountability, measures and evaluation. I think the importance of planning is critically important, and it was fantastic to hear about the work of the Social Exclusion Unit. What that actually did, though, was really foreground the importance of addressing the needs of deprived neighbourhoods across government and across all levels of government. And I think that's a really critically important message that I would want to stress. But also when we talk to communities, particularly in the context of the NDC evaluation, there was a really strong message there about giving communities time to plan as well. So having a year 0 built into programmes which enables communities to effectively get their act together to benefit as much as they possibly can from the incoming investment. So I think that's an important message as well. I think I would also want to echo Angie's thoughts around the relationship with service providers and local government and health providers in particular, because there are some really critical messages from the NDC evaluation about the importance of investment in community leadership and capacity to enable communities to drive forward these sorts of initiatives. But of course, we're in a very different public service context to where we were when NDC was introduced. And there are some real challenges, I think, about capacity and skills in public service organisations to work with deprived neighbourhoods in the way that we would want them to, and in the way that they did in the days of New Deal for Communities. And finally, I think there's also a really important message about, and kind of, I think, following on from that, about focusing the efforts and the resources of mainstream service agencies. Because when we looked at investment through NDC, so we talk about NDC invested 50 million in 39 communities over 10 years, about a 1.5 billion programme budget. That sounds like a huge amount of money, but it's not. We looked at mainstream service investment over the same period. It equates to about £500 per head per year for everybody living in those New Deal for Communities areas. So that's £500 per head to effect change across those 6 outcome areas, 36 indicators. That's a huge ask. The investment and the intention also needs to be on mainstream agencies. We need to think about a way to better integrate neighbourhood level interventions with what's happening at other spatial scales, with other layers of governance, with other strategies for economic renewal. It was an ambition, I think, for the national strategy. There were some really significant achievements around that, but I think that's something that we need to revisit again going forward.
Hilary, do you think we need to be more disciplined in the policy making process in reaching back and looking at those evaluations. I think you were mentioning earlier when you came in, Joe Montgomery sending you an evaluation about the health impacts of some of those programmes.
Yeah.
But that's something that, you know, even with an interest in neighbourhood policy, almost slipped, you know, but certainly not come across my desk.
Yeah.
What do we need to do to make that happen?
The problem is these things are sort of all over the place. This is a study that came out of a health white paper in 2000, or the 5-year plan, Alan Milburn's 5-year plan, and it set up what they call spearhead areas. But they were managed, the whole programme was managed through the Neighbourhood Renewal Unit in DEFRA. So it was a programme on health that was managed in a cross-government way in the main unit that was actually looking at neighbourhood work. And there's an evaluation come out yesterday, Nick Hicks and John Bright, and I think they've done it for the BMA, and they just basically, it's the same sort of lessons that Sarah was talking about. So it's, you know, they say what lessons, when government takes a coordinated approach to a problem and sticks with it over time, the results can be impressive. People need to think about that and learn about that. And then health is a good proxy for levelling up. It is. If you can reduce health inequalities, you reduce other inequalities. Leadership and persistence are essential. So that goes back to building that good local leadership and making sure that you stick with things. Tackling the nation's problems needs longer-term policy making, they're saying. So don't try and do things over a 1-year, a 3-year programme. That was always my biggest problem. How did we get agreement, particularly around money, for longer than the normal one, sometimes 3 years? And that was the huge challenge, was the 10-year. Now, the interesting thing about the Shadow Cabinet is they are all now talking about a 10-year programme because they know it's going to take a long time to get to the level that they know they need to get to, given the economy is so much worse than the last time round. And then it was the approach that worked by influencing how mainstream budgets were used, that they think really worked here. And that was one of the things we were able to do in NDC. We had the right to vary mainstream budgets. So in the Northeast, in the Newcastle NDC, because things like private renting was such a problem then, like note to what it is now, but never mind, it was a problem then. I was able to get for the Northeast NDC a variation in private landlords had to pass the tests around carbon monoxide and their gas fires, etc., because there'd been too many deaths in student accommodation. And so we were able to get an evaluation and an agreement between the local authority and the private tenants, the private rented sector, and they had to get up to standard before they would be eligible for any housing benefit. And that, of course, transformed the way private rented was behaving. So being able to vary mainstream budgets and mainstream, flags was very important. They wouldn't let me do that in London because they said it would mean that I would increase homelessness tremendously. But, you did what you could.
Do we have some more questions? We'll take some from this side. So we've got gentleman at the front, John from Renaissance, then Pete Tyler, halfway back, and then Nick Garden at the back.
Thank you all so much. I've got so many questions, so I'm just trying to not do that. So Renaissance was set up by Kevin, gentleman over there, and 25 years ago, and our history is highly aligned with this, and we were involved in a couple of NDCs. And I was particularly interested in, Angie, your experience post the NDC, and so many of the programs over the last few years that have come from philanthropy and other places have engaged in questions that I think the NDCs were less good at. So it had much less money, but it's done different things by having much less money. And what I'd be interested in is, one, how has your role, Angie, changed, particularly in terms of that governance question, as you've learned more things with different kinds of money coming into your work, and how has your relationship changed with the local authority? Because I think that's been all our learning, is that that's a hugely important thing for any of these sorts of approaches, and how you've had a different role with local government, both during and post NDCs. And then the other side of that is, how do we influence at a national level other bits of local government to engage with the sorts of nuance that is coming from this conversation about their role and so the example that Baroness Armstrong just gave of the levers that could be pulled with the right incentives and the right behaviours could be a really, really positive role for local government. But because local government have experienced so much austerity, I completely understand why local government leaders are just saying, we need more resource now. But more resource isn't the same as the nuance of this conversation. So how do we learn from your governance experience, and how can we work positively with local government leaders in this landscape?
Thank you. Well, I'd like to very much thank Baroness Armstrong for the insight, and also my colleague Sarah and her team for bringing together such a good overview of the evaluation evidence for the National Strategy for Neighbourhood Renewal. I just got a very straightforward question. I share Baroness Armstrong's frustration with the complete inability of successive governments to pass on collective experience when it comes to this agenda. As with my colleagues in this room who've been involved in evaluation, we spent many, many years evaluating things. And over the years, I've looked again, as Baroness Armstrong remarked, at the National Audit Office, commenting every single year virtually about the failure of government to learn lessons. It's a very simple question. How can one improve what I think has been a big state failure in its ability to learn about what works and how it works, and pass that baton over the years? I remember in 1997, as I'm sure Baroness Armstrong does, the policy action teams, I think there were 25 of them, a forensic approach looking at every aspect of the problem then. It was one of the really great things about government at that time. It was inspiring, particularly for academics like me. But, you know, where are we now? And it's somewhat disappointing. So it's a very simple question, and it's an extraordinarily difficult one, and I don't know what the answer, of course, is, but thank you.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Nick Garden, Community Organisers. Really interesting to hear across all three. And one of the things that struck me was this, both whenever I speak to people involved in neighbourhood regeneration, they do talk about community leadership, but at the same time, they also talk about people who've been either advocating for community work policy, or those people actually on the ground doing the practical community work. And what strikes me is that in the community space that I occupy, there's not enough people doing community work. So, like, my question now is, how do we inspire a new generation of community workers and make it a career aspiration, not a career sacrifice, so that actually we can do all the great work that we want to do and build that community leadership?
Thanks. Well, this takes you back to the start of your career. We've noticed, working in communities across the country, there is no community development workforce anymore in the way that there would have been back in 1997. How do we address that challenge if we're trying to remobilise communities on a scale?
I'm afraid this is through local government. I mean, in my day, local government would... in Sunderland, it was remarkable. We had a deputy chief executive who knew that there were real problems in those neighbourhoods where there'd been coal mines shut and steelworks shut, not steelworks, that was my constituency, shipyards shut. And he came up with this idea and employed 5 of us, I think. 4 of us in Sunderland. And out of that came the Community and Youth Work course at the Poly, which I then went to teach on. but it was 4 who were then expected to set up their own governance structures in the neighbourhoods. 2 of them then moved to Sheffield, Ian Smith and Pete Sacker, who were just tremendous, and I learnt so much from them. And they, and basically, we worked with the youth workers. And, you know, where the hell are the youth workers anymore? And this is basically what austerity did, and I don't intend to get too political over this, but, you know, in the northeast, which had the most deprived neighbourhoods collectively, as it were, they had 26% of funding in local government cut between 2010 and 2019. And so things like youth work went out. Actually, the project I set up, Southwick Neighbourhood Youth Project, SNP, it's still there. It's a miracle. They don't get on with the local authority because the local authority withdrew all the funding. But it's still there. And that is the issue. How do you actually build the capacity locally in order to make sure people will do the job? They love doing the job. I taught on a course where we only took people who were over 25 and who had not succeeded at school, but were active in their local community. And that was the sort of ESP of our course at that stage. And it was fantastic. You used to get, you know, they really cared about achieving and about doing things that they'd always been told they couldn't do. So they were a joy to teach and to work with. And there are always people out there who want to do the job, but we've got to have the infrastructure that can employ them.
Angie, how do you experience that on the ground in Leicester? I'm presuming you're one of the few organisations that's actively recruiting and training people to work in communities in Leicester. Perhaps St Matthew's, big local as well, is active in that space as well.
Yeah, mainly homegrown. I mean, we have a community development team, and that is through our own investment. It sort of ties back a little bit to the question you were posing about, you know, sort of how we are now almost, and we've adapted our model over time. In 2010, when the New Deal programme finished, well, prior to that, 2 years before that, we were very concerned that the public sector stakeholders were just literally going to walk away the day the money stopped and the doors. They thought the doors were going to close, I think, but they never were. And we decided to go into the neighbourhood management sort of. There'd been Pathfinder programmes, and we'd been around the country and seen it working, and we thought, well, we'll give it a go, and so we're still doing it now. So we wanted to retain those relationships, but we knew that we were going to have a very different model economically in order to survive and to thrive. And so we set up a trading company, became a charity with a trading company, and essentially converted into a community business. And even now, 70% of our income is self-earned, either through rents or trading activities and so on. And to me, this is absolutely key. We have assets. We have a future. We can see our future financially because we manage it ourselves, and we can invest much of our own money in what we know local people want us to do, and in order that we can continue to respond to need, and that we properly consult on that, we properly involve people in that. But this is, how many areas have that luxury, So, we can do it, but the thing about community, and I'm very proud to say that as of last Thursday, my 21-year-old stepdaughter got a job as a community development worker in Manchester, which we're very pleased about because we were worried that she wouldn't be able to pay the rent. But there is an appetite, I think, in this generation, and if you don't mind me calling you the young man there, talking about entrepreneurship and local young people. There is an appetite, I believe, in many young people now to work in communities, and I think we need to harness that more, and there needs to be an investment in that. But I'm sad to say that in Leicester, de Montfort University had a very well-regarded youth and community degree, and the National Library for Community Work is finishing this very year. The last cohort of students are in this year. I mean, that is, you know, that is a tale in itself. So there's got to be, you know, it's got to be acknowledged, it's got to be reinvested in.
Yeah.
Angie, thank you so much for that. Hilary, Baroness Armstrong, thank you so much for giving up your morning to us. I know you've got to rush off now.
I'm sorry, the messages have been flooding in from people who are waiting for me going to the memorial. So I'm sorry about that.
But thank you so much. It was inspiring, it was informative. Hopefully it's a conversation that will continue over coming years.
And I'll see you tomorrow at the APPG, I hope.
And please, everybody, show your appreciation. Now, I'm conscious that there are still some questions that were, and some hands that were going up in the audience. Angie and Sarah have been kind enough to be able to offer to stay for a few more minutes. If people are interested in another round of questions, we'll certainly be open to that. And then after that round of questions, perhaps we might break up if people want to carry on with informal conversations over coffee before we have to leave the room at 12:30. Do we have any more questions? We've got one at the second row from the back there, and then one at the front, and another at the very front.
Hi, I'm Jenny Popey. Been involved in evaluating these kinds of initiatives for a long time, including DH-funded secondary analysis of the New Deal for Communities data. And I've got lots of questions as well, so I'm not going to ask them all. But the issue that hasn't been raised yet is this kind of hidden story about the unequal benefits of these kinds of initiatives. So the New Deal for Community evaluation we did was looking at health inequalities and the social drivers, and there was some indication that actually within these neighbourhoods and between the neighbourhoods the benefits were unequal. And the recent evaluation we've done of local trust, as Matt knows, there's again some indication that within local trust neighbourhoods, within big local neighbourhoods, women don't benefit as much as men, and the poor of the poorest don't benefit either. So my question is how there is a very positive story about these initiatives, but there's a hidden story that's not so positive. And what do we do to reduce that, those unequal benefits, really? I've not got an answer, but I think it's really important because it's decades old, this story, that those who are the poorest are not doing as well out of these. And they may be damaging them indeed. So.
Hi, Francois here from Onward. I had a question about looking forward. How should we identify neighbourhoods which are in the most need of funding? Is it going to be through a competitive process of the so-called Hunger Games? The risk, of course, is you get those who are very good at bidding who get the money. Or do we go for a model where we allocate money, but on which indicators would we want to do that, and how has that changed in the last 20 years?
Thank you. I'm Shobha Jakumar. I teach at UCL about the voluntary sector and leadership, and I lead my own non-profit called Impatience, because we're impatient for change. I worked as a community development worker in the 1980s in the most deprived, as it was then, neighbourhood in Europe, which was Spitalfields in Tower Hamlets. And it's really a little bit of a reflection and then a question that relates to the first speaker in this segment. My funding as a community development worker was to work with the community around health issues, so as a public health worker, and it was funded by joint funding from the local authority and the health authority. And I think that's really important in this conversation, because Baroness Armstrong talked about local authority, but actually health authority is really important in this. I subsequently got 8 people funded through what was the joint funding process at that time, and I'm very happy to say that the organisation I founded is still going strong today, Social Action for Health in Tower Hamlets. So that's fabulous. So I think, you know, my takeaway from my time there, and I still put in voluntary work to Tower Hamlets so many years later, is community development, community leadership is critical. And that, yes, the community has the solutions. I think on the question that was asked about women, I would also add disabled people into that. We really are a forgotten group of people, and of course we are in all neighbourhoods. You know, almost 25% of the population is disabled, and during COVID, which we haven't, I think, mentioned today, almost 60% of those who died were disabled, and within the 60%, 59.7 or something like that, right? 91% were women, and were women like me, who are, you know, in the 40 to 60 age range, working women. So what is going on? So, you know, I did also want to concur with the speaker who raised kind of the inequalities within the inequitable benefits, and sort of plead for that to be perhaps fairer, you know, looked at or raised in these discussions. Thank you.
Thanks. So, I think two questions quite linked. They're around addressing issues of inequality and exclusion and inclusion, and separately one of how if there is to be another wave of neighbourhood areas, we might go about identifying them. Should we start with that latter point? Braunston, how are you identified as an NDC? Were you there at the time?
No, not in '99, when I think almost the invitations were made for that, and there was a bun fight locally within Leicester to be chosen to be the air. I don't think it was quite the Hunger Games, but there was certainly competition, as it was, for we're the worst, don't we? Yeah, clearly we were the worst, but yeah. So I don't know technically how that came about. There must have been some filtering down and through the government offices and various conversations. But yeah, I think it's a really good question, because it's going to be very, very difficult, isn't it? If there are going to be significant investments in neighbourhoods again, whether it could even be all across the country and in so many areas, as was the NDC in '39. I mean, if you look at the big local programme, 150, isn't it? It's a huge breadth, but in terms of the financial investment, a small proportion really. So I don't know. In as much as should it be based on need? Well, we would always argue that, wouldn't we? That it should be based on need, but I think it's even more complex than that now. And the spatial stuff about the place, and this thing about place, I've not sort of touched on it, but Baroness Armstrong made good points about that shift into talking about place-based rather than neighbourhood. We absolutely call ourselves neighbourhood in everything that we do and we say, and because I think place becomes, it's difficult, isn't it, for people to have that sort of that concept. And Leicester positions itself as place. They do place-based programmes. They might cover a third of the city, half of the county. It's the whole notion of place, I think, is difficult for people. But yeah, I don't know, but it should be based on need, in my opinion, and I can't see that anybody could argue against that. But how it's done in terms of the place-based pressures and the context of the local economics and so on, I think it's going to be extremely difficult. Extremely difficult.
Certainly a challenge. I think we've seen as we've looked to learn from Big Local, where there were some basic boundaries around deprivation and lack of access to previous grant funding, which quite often came up with a place which benefited from the programme, but also on occasion suffered from over-engagement engagement of local politics in the sort of big P and small p sense, which resulted in an estate and a half, which then ended up fighting for 5 years over fair shares, or a bunch of villages with no connection between one another and no sense of common identity. And getting that balance right of, I think transparency around allocation formulae and need, and a really good, strong metric set. I know, Francois, you've been working on some of that at Onward, as we have a local trust, but doing that in the context of a commitment to a very, very strong local government voice is something that I think is going to challenge any government seeking to do this sort of thing again. Did the evaluations look at how NDC areas were identified, Sarah?
We did a bit. So local politics very definitely played a part in this. There was something of a local bum fight. I can see NDC colleagues nodding along with that. There was a use of the IMD in terms of a kind of initial classification of potentially eligible communities, I guess. But then essentially down to the question of local politics. So partly that was about who shouted the loudest, partly that was about which areas had previous investment or not. But there was also this slightly strange notion, I think, around capacity to benefit from the funding as well. And this was something that was kind of involved in these local conversations, which, based on the assumption that the investment was going to go into areas that had some existing level of infrastructure or capacity to manage the money. And this takes us back to those questions around local accountability and how we approach that. On the one hand, that makes sense because you want to invest in areas where you know that money is going to be well used. But of course, what that then also does is miss out all of those areas which don't have the existing infrastructure and capacity to take on the money in the first instance. And we did a little bit of modelling in terms of NDC areas, and we looked at some characteristics of those areas at the outset of the NDC investment and where they got to at the end. And what we know from that is that there were particular challenges around particular areas. So communities on the periphery of kind of towns and cities, often quite homogenous populations, kind of what we might classify as white working class communities, achieve less benefits perhaps than those which were more diverse, which were more closely connected to local labour market and economic opportunities and so on. So we know that some areas benefited differently from the investment, and there are also some characteristics of partnerships that we could model as well. So those that had a greater level of community involvement, some findings about where the money was invested, how the money was spent, and so on. So all of these things make a difference in terms of the outcomes achieved. But in terms of the identification of the areas initially, I would say absolutely not. Competition, no. Economic deprivation is critically important, but arguably the IMD over-focuses on economic deprivation and doesn't necessarily take account of some of those things that we know that neighbourhood renewal and neighbourhood regeneration is particularly good at addressing. So questions around social capital and social infrastructure, questions around environmental issues and so on. All of the things that we know that neighbourhood renewal is particularly good at aren't necessarily reflected adequately in those measures. So I would be arguing for a kind of broader understanding around the needs of neighbourhoods on which to direct investment. On the question of inequality, I would say we didn't pay enough attention to inequality in the NDC evaluation. I think where we putting together an evaluation these days, we would want to pay much greater attention to issues of gender, to differential outcomes from different ethnic communities, for people with disabilities, for people facing particular challenges. We didn't particularly do that analysis to any great extent. But I will say that one of the things that we did look at was around the kind of question of community engagement and who took part in NDC initiatives. And what we did see there was a lack of diversity, particularly in the kind of the management and the delivery of neighbourhood programmes. We saw that there were some challenges within communities about getting particular communities engaged and benefiting from NDC initiatives. So I think those are some of the dimensions that we would need to look at in a future programme. but we also need a much better understanding, I think, about the differential outcomes for different communities within these neighbourhoods from neighbourhood renewal initiatives.
Angie, how's that worked in practice in Braunston? 'Cause you've had a very long run at it now. How have you addressed issues of inclusion and diversity within Leicester?
And it's changed over time very much. And I think the question raises a particular point. I mean, if you look at our own outcomes in our neighbourhood, you know, the health outcomes for women are still far worse than men. Mm-hmm. And Braunston has got the worst health outcomes in the city. So how does that work? You know, Leicester's got the worst children's oral health in the country. We top the division every year, and Braunston's got the worst in Leicester. So we must have the worst children's oral health in the country, you know, by the fact. So there are so many sort of like glaring inequalities, you know. During the programme, I suppose we tried to, you know, sort of focus down and do particular things, and you know, there were particular people projects around disability and women, you know, women-focused, women-only projects and that sort of thing, those sorts of investments. And subsequent to that, obviously, we've done lots of different thematic work to try and, you know, to tackle those sort of inequalities. But it's a massive job. It's huge. And I always say to people, you know, the NDC was around for 10 years. We've been around for 23. We've been let down for 40 years before that. You know, how do we turn this round, really? And that's in the backdrop of everything else that's, you know, the inequalities within the country and beyond. So, yeah, it's always a battle to try and level things on that way. And it's far from getting there, I think, really. But at least we are still, we're still trying, we're still investing in that. And we are trying to always enable people to improve their own situations, their own circumstances. So working with people. And I suppose in many ways, people in lots of other areas just don't even have that opportunity. They don't have that investment.
Angie, thanks so much. I think that's probably a good point to round up what's been an absolutely fascinating event. I think, you know, looking back on a rich history of the NDC, but also a sense that government initiatives can be both impactful, offer good value for money, and still keep going almost a decade or more after they were initiated and launched. Thanks to you both, Sarah and Angie, for your contributions. Also, thank you to Baroness Armstrong for her inspirational contribution to today's event. Please do look forward to and look out for this report when it comes out in full. Be really interested in your input. Also look forward to the APPG on Left Behind Neighbourhoods, which will be publishing a report on the state of neighbourhoods today and levelling up at a neighbourhood level within the next couple of days. It feels like this is an important live debate. The fact that so many of you turned out today is a testament to that. Thank you all for your enthusiasm and input. We've got the room now for another 15 minutes if you want to continue the conversation over coffee. But thanks again.